in debt, a man with no realized property coming to him in reversion, was called upon to live, and to live as though at his ease, among those had been born to wealth. And indeed he had so cleverly learned the ways of the wealthy that he hardly knew any longer how to live at ease among the poor. But had he walked warily when he went down to Richmond, and afterwards, sitting alone in the obscurity of his chamber, wrote the letter which had made Lucy Morris so happy? It must be acknowledged that he did in truth love the girl, that he was capable of strong feeling. She was not beautiful, hardly even pretty, small in appearance, almost insignificant, quite penniless, a governess. He had often asked himself what it was that had so vanquished him. She always wore a pale grey frock, with perhaps a grey ribbon, never running into any bright form of clothing. She was educated, very well educated, but she owned no great accomplishment. She had not sung his heart away, or ravished him with the harp. Even of her words she was sparing, seeming to care more to listen than to speak. A humble little thing to look at, one of whom you might say that she regarded herself as well placed if left in the background. Yet he had found her out and knew her. He had recognized the treasure and had greatly desired to possess it. He had confessed to himself that could splendour and ambition be laid aside, that little thing would be all the world to him. As he sat in court or in the House, patient from practice, as he half listened to the ponderous speeches of advocates or politicians, he would think of the sparkle in her eye, of the dimple in her chin, of the lines of the mouth which could plead so eloquently, though with few words. To sit on some high seat among his countrymen, and also to marry Lucy Morris, that would be a high ambition. He had chosen his way now, and she was engaged to be his wife. As he thought of it after he had done it, it was not all happiness, all contentment with him. He did feel that he had crippled himself, impeded himself in running the race, as it were, with a log around his leg. He had offered to marry her, and he must do so at once, or almost at once, because she could not now find no other home but his. He knew, as well as did Lady Fawn, that she could not go into another family as governess, and he knew also that she ought not to remain in Lady Fawn's house an hour longer than she would be wanted there. He must alter his plan of living at once, give up the luxury of his rooms at the Grosvenor, take a small house somewhere, probably near the Swiss cottage, come up and down to his chambers by the underground railway, and, in all probability, abandon Parliament altogether. He was not sure whether in good faith he should not at once give notice of his intended acceptance of the Chiltern Hundreds to the electors of Bobsborough, thus mediating under the influence of that intermittent evil grasp, almost angry with himself for the open truth which he had spoken, or rather written, and perhaps thinking more of Lizzie and her beauty than he should have done. In the course of the 3 weeks he had paid but one visit to Fawn Court. Then of a sudden, finding himself one afternoon relieved from work, he resolved to go there. The weeks were still almost at their longest, and he did not scruple to present himself before Lady Fawn between 8 and 9 in the evening. They were all at tea, and he was welcomed kindly. Lucy, when he was announced, at once got up and met him almost at the doorway, sparkling with just a tear of joy in her eye, with a look in her face and a loving manner, which for the moment made him sure that the little house near the Swiss cottage would, after all, be the only Elysium upon earth. If she spoke a word he hardly heard it, but her hand was in his, so cool and soft, almost trembling in its grasp, with no attempt to withdraw itself, frank, loving, and honest. There was a perfect satisfaction in her greeting which at once told him that she had no discontented thoughts, had had no such thought, because he had been so long without coming. To see him was a great joy, but every hour of her life was a joy to her, knowing, as she did know, that he loved her. Lady Fawn was gracious, the girls were hospitable, and he found himself made very welcome amidst all the women at the tea-table. Not a word was said about Lizzie Eustace. Lady Fawn talked about Parliament, and professed to pity a poor lover who was so bound to his country that he could not see his mistress above once a fortnight. "But there'll be good time coming next month," she said, for it was now July. "Though the girls can't make their claims felt, the grouse can." "It isn't the house altogether that rules me with a rod of iron, Lady Fawn," said Frank, "but the necessity of earning daily bread by the sweat of my brow. A man who has to sit in court all day must take the night, or indeed any time that he can get, to read up his cases." "But the grouse put a stop to all work," said Lady Fawn. "My gardener told me just now that he wanted a day or two in August. I don't doubt but that he is going to the moors. Are you going to the moors, Mr. Greystock?" As it happened, Frank Greystock did not quite know whether he was going to the moors or not. The Ayrshire grouse shooting is not the best in Scotland, but there is a grouse shooting in Ayrshire, and the shooting at the Portray Mountains is not the worst shooting in the county. The castle at Portray overhangs the sea, but there is a wild district attached to it stretching far back inland, in regard to which Lizzie Eustace was very proud of talking of her shooting. Early in the spring of the present year she had asked her cousin Frank to accept the shooting for the coming season, and he had accepted it. "I shall probably be abroad," she said, "but there is the old castle." She had offered it as though he had been her brother, and he had said that he would go down for a couple of weeks, not to the castle, but to a little lodge some miles up from the sea, of which she told him when he declined the castle. When this invitation was given, there was no engagement between her and Lord Fawn. Since that date, within the last day or two, she had reminded him of it. "Won't his lordship be there?" he had asked laughingly. "Certainly not," she had answered him with serious earnestness. Then she had explained that her plan of going abroad had been set aside by circumstances. She did mean to go down to Portray. "I couldn't have you at the castle," she said, smiling, "but even an Othello couldn't object to a first cousin at a little cottage ever so many miles off." It wasn't for him to suggest what objections might rise to the brain of a modern Othello, but after some hesitation he said that he would be there. He had promised the trip to a friend, and would like to keep his promise. But, nevertheless, he almost thought that he ought to avoid Portray. He intended to support his cousin as far as he might do so honestly, but he was not quite minded to stand by her through good report and evil report. He did not desire to be specially known as her champion, and yet he felt that that position would be almost forced upon him. He foresaw danger, and consequently he was doubting about his journey to Scotland. "I hardly know whether I am or not," said Frank, and he almost felt that he was blushing. "I hope you are," said Lucy. "When a man has to work all day and nearly all night, he should go where he may get fresh air." "There's very good air without going to Scotland for it," said Lady Fawn, who kept up an excellent house in Richmond, but who, with all her daughters, could not afford autumn trips. The Fawns lived at Fawn Court all the year round, and consequently Lady Fawn thought that the air was to be found in England sufficiently good for all purposes of vitality and recreation. "It's not quite the same thing," said Lucy, "at least not for a man." After that she was allowed to escape into the grounds with her lover, and was made happy with half an hour of unalloyed bliss. To be alone with the girl to whom he is not engaged is a man's delight. To be alone with the man to whom she is engaged is the woman's. When the thing is settled there is always present to the man something of a feeling of clipped wings, whereas the woman